Morning, everyone, and welcome to the next session around ERM. My name is Nashlan Portreg, Head of Funds at Work and Distribution at Momentum Corporate, one of your chairs for the session today. I'm also joined by my co-chair for today, Lindsay Shooters. He's a distinguished business journalist, editor, as well as storyteller in South Africa. He currently works at the Daily Maverick. I'm now going to hand over to him to introduce the topic as well as our speakers for today. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you very much. And thank you guys very much for joining us for this. It's a climate risk and the ORSA session with Lance Moroney, Kyle Campbell, Kershal. Hey? ORSA. Oh my gosh, guys. I'm only a journalist. I know what the words mean. Own risk and solvency assessment. But yes, ORSA. With Lance Moroney, Kyle Campbell, Kershal Sauls, and Kareshni Naidu, and they'll unpack how climate risk is reshaping every layer of the ORSA process, from governance and scenario planning to model validation and tail risk qualification. The insights draw on work from the ASSA Climate Risk Committee and seasoned ORSA practitioners with a sharp focus on how SAM standard formula calibration is evolving to reflect climate realities. Can we give them a round of applause as they make their way up? ASSA is ASSA, right? It's not like ASA.
We are in the business of acronyms, Lindsay.
Hi. Good morning. Well, Donald Trump might not agree, but I think climate risk is a really important topic, especially when it comes to the ORSA. You might need the presentation. So in terms of the schedule today, I'm going to start with a section giving an overview to climate risk, or set the context. Kareshni is going to continue with some ORSA guidance. Then Kershal will cover a section on life insurance and see if climate risk is important to the life insurance industry. And Carl, the same for the short-term insurance industry. We start with a quote by, I would say, a much more reliable character when it comes to the topic of climate change. Sir David Attenborough, a living legend at the age of 99, renowned natural historian. He gives two key messages here. And I have to think of that slide by Jeremy Gardner this morning at the youth of the UK who don't want to join the army. So we've gotten used to this comfortable lives that we live. But what is this disaster that he's talking about? Temperatures since the 1940s have just been going up and up post-industrialization. The top two highlighted lines are the 2023 temperature and the 2024. Already in 2023, that line appears to jump ahead. It is in fact an acceleration of an increase in temperatures, something to such an extent that even the top climate scientists don't fully understand. So as a working group, we decided, let's see where 2024 is at. And indeed, it seems to jump up yet again and seems to safely exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That was a target set when signing the Paris Climate Accord to limit global warming to within 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming at the time of signing that in 2015. So what does the science say? Indeed, the science says the world is going to get hotter. This was predicted quite a while back. And the explanation is the greenhouse gases or emissions in the atmosphere is like a current running into an oven. So what we then can expect with this current running to an oven is it's going to warm. It's going to get warmer, but it's going to take a while. And there's two key uncertainties with that, though, is that we don't know, the science is not that exact, that in terms of we don't know exactly the rate at which temperatures are going to increase. And we also don't know the ultimate temperature level where we're going to reach with the current level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And this is already having an impact on catastrophic weather events that we're witnessing throughout the world. And of course, when it comes to anything cooking and maybe baking a cake, leaving the oven on too long, you might literally end up baking the cake with the world inside there. In terms of where it might end up, there's a range of forecasts out there. The IPCC, perhaps the largest body of climate scientists, their latest estimate in 2023 is that we'll end up at 3 degrees Celsius global increase from pre-industrial levels. But that's not the only estimate. There's alternative estimates from other scientists at even higher, that will end up at even higher levels with quite serious consequences if you ever reach the levels of 4 or 5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The reason why this ongoing increase in temperatures is very concerning and critical is as temperatures continue to increase, we reach climate tipping points. On the left-hand side there, those key Earth systems are already at risk at 2 degrees, 1.5 to 2 degrees global warming. So the Greenland ice sheet, West Antarctic ice sheet is already being impacted. And as it continues to rise, more Earth systems come into play, like the extrapolar alpine glaciers. And we could actually face a scenario of reaching multiple tipping points. And tipping points is when these Earth systems are so devastated, they actually, by the impact of global warming, they reach the point of no return. And that has a further knock-on impact on the environment, the impact of which is not very easy for climate scientists to actually fully understand, how, the demise of those key Earth systems will have in terms of climate, ocean currents, etc. So in the middle, the picture in the middle is the West Antarctic and the Greenland ice sheet. There's been a significant loss of ice from these two Earth systems since the 1990s, and that was at temperatures already, well below current levels, well below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we already seen the impacts of that, of those initial climate tipping points we saw in the diagram. And then on the right-hand side is an example of that extrapolar alpine glacier, an example of which is the Himalayan ice cap. So the Himalayan ice cap is the source of rivers that flow into some key countries, a number of countries, including China, India, Nepal. Significant melting of that ice cap, which starts being impacted at roughly 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, will have a significant impact on those countries in terms of water security, ecosystems, and the economy. So that example gives us just one specific example, reaching a climate tipping point, an impact on the natural environment can have a knock-on impact on society, the economy. And it's clear that there's, in the context of climate risk, there's a whole landscape of interconnected risk that potentially come into play. Although it might be easier to consider risks in isolation, this is not how the reality of the real world is. This is not the case. So risks and the impact of a risk is the function of a hazard, which is a process or phenomenon that causing damage, and then the exposure of the people or the property in the hazard-prone area. And then you have a vulnerability, which is economic, physical, social factors, environmental factors that could exacerbate the impact of that event. And so this diagram is compiled annually by the World Economic Forum, where the aim is to assess the impact of global risks. And a global risk is what they regard as something that has the potential, or what the purpose is to understand an event that could have significantly impact a high proportion of the world GDP or the population. It becomes clear from this work that failure to mitigate against climate risk could lead to resource crises, involuntary mass migration, and state collapse. Of course, mass migration from one state has a knock-on impact on another state. What we typically look at in terms of climate risk is your physical risks, transition risks, and liability risks. So physical risks are your acute impacts arising from weather events like storms and flood. The chronic risk is the long-term climate changes like temperature increases impacting, for example, agriculture, and transition risk. Transition risk is also very significant in the scenario of climate risk. We must, and the world has to adjust itself and shift to a low carbon economy. With that comes regulatory changes and also the adoption of new technologies, skills. So there's a significant adjustment that needs to happen. And then lastly, liability risks is, over time, as investors in the market become more sensitive, companies could be held more and more liable for if they seem to be contributing to pollution of the environment. Dr. Mary Bapapi, who's MD of Earth Systems Studies in South Africa, has undergone research of weather disasters in the period 1982 to 2023, and this has indeed shown an increase in both the frequency and severity of climate-related events. And certainly in the insurance world as well, we've seen the impact in the last 5-10 years of an increased level of losses arising from catastrophe events. Whilst the study of Dr. Papapi notes that KZN and the east side of the country might be more exposed and prone to these hazard events, the impact of urbanization could exacerbate that. And she notes the urgency for ongoing and further development of early warning systems and increased communication between scientists and government to prepare for the impact and mitigate against the impact of climate change. Another reference that we've also included here, a study of the physical impact of climate risk in the context of South Africa, the Green Book. So that was done by a South African South African climate professor was part of that group, part of that study. He's part of the IPCC, and there's been a climate projection model built and published by projecting the impact of alternative emission scenarios in South Africa at a much higher resolution, reflecting more specifically the lie of the land, etc., climatic factors. So that's also key for awareness, what's happened in the past and what futures might be faced in South Africa in terms of the impact of physical risk. In terms of transition risk for South Africa, another key topic. We are one of the highest emitting economies in the world. Returning, the path there's a significant path to turning our economy in South Africa to net zero, and significant changes that need to happen to move away from our coal-producing power plants to clean energy power plants, and just so many other sectors in terms of the move away of fossil fuels and adoption of clean energy technology. But this, at the same time, is in the context of transition risk itself. South Africa itself faces a risk of not transitioning. If we don't transition, we've heard a lot of talk about tariffs today. If we don't transition, the goods that we produce will come with a high carbon footprint and will impact the competitiveness of our products over time, as potentially we're going to an uncertain future, but we're already seeing the emergence of this, for example, in Europe, one of our key markets that we export to. So it's as quoted, in the national best interest for South Africa to transition its economy towards net zero, but a significant task that lies ahead of us, and also at the same time important in terms of the quality of our natural environment. In terms of when we might reach net zero, so this diagram, I think, sets out where we're at right now and the significant task that lies ahead of the world to ultimately reach net zero, which requires a significant move away from fossil fuel use, adoption of clean energy technologies, while simultaneously, in fact, at the same time, developing new technologies to remove carbon emissions from the atmosphere, and that is still required to ultimately reach net zero. And in the context of this, and an interesting article I read the other day, would anybody know when China expects to reach net zero? So China is probably the leading economy in terms of the development of clean energy technologies as well as the adoption. There's two key things there. And they're at the moment predicting of reaching net zero by 2060. The US follows that, and of course, there we have our friend Mr. Trump, and he's, I guess, may caused a little bit of a disruption to the process of the key global and emitting economies meeting and agreeing and committing to the carbon budgets in terms of when meeting net zero and being accountable for that. Would be nice, I guess, for Mr. Trump to be there, but he's not, and that kind of takes a little bit of the pressure off the other key economies in kind of being accountable and committing to their carbon budgets. The next key countries in line there, Russia, Japan, also not before 2060. So any climate scenario projection that anticipates reaching the world reaching net zero by 2050 no longer seems plausible. And it's just one more uncertainty. We've talked a lot about the uncertainties when it comes to climate and how this might play out in the future. The last uncertainty is when the point at which the world will ultimately meet net zero, which is so important to stabilize the impact of global warming. And there is the last thing I wanted to say. To close off on my section, if we leave the oven on for too long, then the world inside that oven might ultimately get baked. So also quite a concerning aspect of global warming.
So we can definitely see that the world around us is changing, and climate risk is no longer something we can treat as a concern only for future generations. Regulatory bodies globally are increasing their expectations with regards to climate risk and what insurers should be doing. But beyond compliance, the real risk and opportunity lies in how an insurer chooses to approach this risk within their own business. On that note, the PA has issued comprehensive guidance on how insurers should be responding to climate risk. Although these guidance notes are not yet mandatory, it could potentially become so as the PA plans to increase supervision in the future. There are 4 areas on which the PA discusses in these guidance notes, which are governance, risk management, the ORSA, and disclosures. We'll look at each of them briefly before diving a little bit deeper into the ORSA. When it comes to governance, it's clear that the tone at the top matters. It's the ultimate responsibility of the board of directors and your senior management in order to ensure that climate risk is incorporated within your business strategy and risk appetite. With risk management, our focus moves to integration. Here, we want to see integration across our business functions, including actuarial, internal audit, risk, and compliance. Additionally, there's also a focus on outsourcing. Here, the insurer will want to assess how third-party providers are exposed to climate risks, how they manage in these climate risks, and how does this impact the insurer themselves. On the ORSA, we will look at it in a bit more detail, but the key point to note here is that the emphasis now moves to expanding our frameworks to incorporate climate risk within our ORSA and governance and risk management frameworks. On disclosures, the PA issues comprehensive guidance on how insurers should be ensuring transparency with regards to climate risk and how they should communicate the 3 sections we've just discussed on governance, risk management, and the ORSA. They should also be including key risk indicators and performance indicators to ensure that results are disclosed appropriately. Now, whilst that's a mouthful and a lot to remember, the key message here is that climate risk is no longer a standalone risk, but rather moves to something that needs to be incorporated within your governance structures, your capital planning, as well as your reporting frameworks. Before considering climate risk considerations in the ORSA, let's briefly recap on what is an ORSA exactly. So in simple terms, the ORSA is the insurer's own forward-looking assessment on the risks it faces, how these risks impact the company's solvency in now and in the future, as well as how much of capital the insurer would need in order to stay solvent should these risks arise. This is precisely why the ORSA is a powerful tool to assess climate risk, given the uncertain and emerging nature of climate risk. Looking at climate risk considerations within the ORSA itself, how do we actually incorporate this in? So the first step would definitely be to assess your risk profile and your company's exposures to ensure that you identify all potential physical, liability, and transition risks. Now, this is particularly important for companies who have high catastrophe exposures, but even so, for companies with low exposures, they shouldn't choose to ignore this. Instead, materiality comes into play here, and if you have low exposures, the insurer should still ensure that they do a sufficient assessment, document this assessment, as well as justify why their position is found as so, and ensure that appropriate controls are in place to monitor this position going forward. With regards to capital implications, here we want to see what is the financial implications of climate risk within your company. So now we know most insurers use the standard formula. However, it should be noted that a validation assessment of key risk submodules should be done to ensure that climate risk is actually allowed for adequately enough. On stress and scenario analysis, this is where we see climate risk coming into focus the most within most insurers currently. My colleagues will go into this in much more detail, but the overall message here is that stress and scenario analysis can be done both qualitatively and quantitatively. A key challenge that comes into play here is definitely that we have time horizons. We know that climate risk is a long-term risk, whereas your typical ORSA planning period is 3 to 5 years. On documentation, finally, this is where the insurer needs to ensure that your climate risk ORSA report is explicitly stating your risks, as well as the key results, as well as processes employed in the previous three areas to ensure that climate risk was properly and adequately assessed. Furthermore, in your governance policies, risk policies, as well as just your internal controls in your everyday business, these should be expanded to include climate risk. The HAF would also play a key role here to ensure that the company has appropriately assessed climate risk, as well as the assumptions, methodology, and capital implications disclosed in your ORSA reports. So whilst all of this gives a good structure to assess climate risk within your ORSA, there is, of course, key challenges that present itself. As we know, most actuarial work involves data, and with this data comes challenges as well. So the first challenge I'd like to highlight is that past experience on climate-related events is no longer credible to project into the future. As we know, climate risk is emerging and evolving in nonlinear ways. Secondly, we know that climate events are of low frequency and high severity in nature. Given this, we have limited data to work with in the first place. On model and parameter risk, we've seen that traditional models have been stretched beyond their initial purpose to actually cater for climate-related risks. And whilst this is not technically correct, it is being done so as it is a new risk, and structures are not in place currently to assess it adequately enough. On time horizon, so we have already discussed this, but here we are balancing our long-term nature of climate risk against our short-term planning horizon in our ORSA. Lastly, the risk I'd like to highlight is that with regards to climate risk, it's no longer standalone, but rather correlated to our usual risks we used to see and we used to quantify, but also some other risks, which is a little bit more difficult to quantify. For example, reputational risks. All of these factors come into play and make scenario design quite complex and challenging. But despite these challenges, I would think that the answer is not to wait, but rather to be willing to engage with the uncertainty and to start assessing climate risk within your companies.
Cool. I think I just want to start by saying, look, we didn't ask the convention center to play with the air conditioning, because that it would be a good way to bring the message home around around climate change, of course. So we didn't do that. But yeah, I should probably stand like this a little bit. So I'm going to talk about the specific focus on life insurers. And basically, we're going to pull together a lot of the existing frameworks and guidance, either from the PA or ASA or working papers, to just basically illustrate what has already been done and sort of what can what life insurance companies do in terms of the ORSA. Oh, good. All right, thank you. All right, so I see a lot of risk management practitioners in the room, so I'm pretty sure that this is something everybody, or all of them, would be familiar with, and it also looks very similar to an actuarial control cycle, so I think most people in the room would be very familiar with this. And the useful thing about a risk management control cycle is the fact that it is very useful in terms of constructing and calibrating ORSA and ORSA scenarios, because it covers all of the same key points around risk identification, assessments, mitigation, monitoring, and so forth. So that means it's very, very well aligned, and it makes sure that you're able to pick up all of your risks. And what that then does, by going through this process and sort of noting your findings as you move through each one of these steps, one of the good things is that you're able to find that you're constructing a scenario, climate change scenario, that is actually considerate of all the underlying risks that you are exposed to, and it's hopefully well documented, and the assumptions would appear reasonable. This is a climate change risk taxonomy, effectively. And the useful thing about this is that it allows for the mapping of risks. So if you go through these sorts of mapping of risk, what is quite useful is it means that you are able to actually think of each and every component. So what we've done here, and this is an overly simplified example, where we look at the climate impact, we split it between physical and transitional risk, and we look at each of the risks under each one of those. For a typical life insurer, what you'll find is under the insurance risk, you probably have a fourth tier that looks at the additional mortality, morbidity, and probably retrenchment risk, depending on the type of business that you're writing. All right. So the ASA's Climate Change Committee has a climate impact and mortality morbidity working party that produced a paper or framework, a framework that sets out exactly how insurers, life insurers and health insurers can actually look at quantifying and assessing their risks as it pertains to climate risk. So what we have here is a nice little worked example, which illustrates a couple of viewpoints that the risk, first of all, that the risk that you're exposed to will be very much dependent on the business that you're writing. And also what we also need to consider is actually the geolocation of your risk. Because depending on where your risk is being written, that will affect the type of hazards that you are exposed to. And in this example, we can clearly see that what they've done is that they've split out the KZN funeral cover from the rest of the country. And why that had to be done is because of the actual hazard being so significantly different in KZN, with it being floods as opposed to the rest of the country, where it tends to be more extreme heat, right? So what this does then, by going through this process and doing this sort of qualitative assessment, what you're able to identify is what are those key hazards that you are exposed to through the business that you're writing, and then you can tailor your stress and scenarios to those hazards. Once we've done your quantitative or your qualitative assessment, you have to, at some point, probably go into a more quantitative one. And for that, we need a lot of information, a lot of resources. some of which might not have really available. So you will be encouraged to look at research that has already been done. And what we've done here is basically just pointed you to 3 specific studies that were performed that give quite useful information on exactly what we expect the mortality and morbidity impacts to be as a result from climate change. So in the first one, the impact on extreme temperature on mortality of a sample of insured lives in South Africa, what they were observing was 2 groups, one a pensioner group and the other was a group of funeral business. And what they found was for the pension book, it seemed like more extreme heat, so higher temperatures resulted in more deaths. And that probably speaks to the age demographic of that book. Whereas on the funeral book, what they found that was quite the opposite actually, where colder weather, so basically reduction in temperature, resulted in more deaths. And that probably speaks more to the socioeconomic categorization of that business. The publication by Dr. Irene Merck from SCORE that looks at insurance business and the more focus on the specific unique risk that insurers will be faced due to the long-term nature of their book. And then the other study that we've listed here is the climate change impact on mortality and morbidity. So it's this study that we found our previous worked example of that qualitative assessment that we've done. All right. Moving on to macroeconomic effects. So we've looked at sort of underwriting risks and moving on to macroeconomics. So here too, there's a bunch of studies that has been done, and we've just taken a couple of snips around research that has been done that could be quite useful in terms of calibrating scenarios as when one looks at the asset side of your portfolio or your balance sheet actually. So yeah, so as you see there, the World Economic Forum quoted the UN indicating that climate change is costing Africa up to 5% of its GDP, which is obviously quite concerning. And we also, the blue picture shows the economic damage from climate risk over the period from 2022 to 2025. And we see there that it's actually costing the global economy around 0.8% of its GDP annually, which is quite concerning. And I think probably more concerning is what we see there is from The Guardian, showing that we expect the economy the global economy to basically, the GDP to be halved between 2070 and 2090 as a result of climate shock. So that is quite extreme and something that we need to be quite concerned about. This slide looks at basically a summary of what ESSA's scenario analysis framework tells us or guides us in terms of constructing scenarios for climate change. So it suggests that one starts with a qualitative scenario, so looking at plausible climate scenarios in terms of the average changes in temperatures and what that would look like, and then effectively translate that into actual insurance risks. So if we are saying that temperature is going to increase by 3 degrees Celsius, what exactly does that mean in terms of your mortality or morbidity exposure and the risk underlying that? And only once you've identified where you think your key risks are, do you then move on to doing a quantitative assessment. Key considerations here is your business objectives. So this effectively means that insurers will now actually have to think about their risk appetite for climate-related risk, because you need that in order to actually put it into to look at the business element of it. Secondly, and Kirishni spoke to this, is the time horizon. When it comes to climate risk, unfortunately, we can't just look at 3 to 5 years as we typically do for ORSAs. We need to look at longer periods. The PA's guidance on climate risk is very clear on that. We need to look at longer periods so that we can actually see the impact of climate change. And in the actual scenario analysis framework set up by ESSA, they actually look at a 25-year horizon, which I feel is adequate in terms of showing the impact without necessarily looking much longer and therefore becoming maybe less reliable. Data availability is obviously a big concern. You need data from different spectrums. You need data on climate change. You need data on your mortality, morbidity experience, and all those sorts of things. And then I think the other caution is around the severity of the assumptions and the stresses that is performed. So we're cautioned against looking or doing scenarios that aren't extreme enough. So I think that's quite important. And unfortunately, for a lot of medium and smaller insurers, they might not actually have the resources to actually construct an actual scenario for themselves. And therefore, one could rely on publicly available scenarios like the NGFS scenarios, which I'll speak to now. So NGFS stands for a Network for Greening the Financial System, and they have looked at three different scenarios in terms of climate change. And one is the bottom right corner there, the White House world, that's our current policies. So that's basically looking at the scenario if nothing changes, if we just continue on as we are going at the moment with no real climate change policies being implemented. And we see that the global temperatures are expected to increase by at least 3 degrees Celsius. And because we're not actually transitioning, there will be no transition risk, but there will be quite a significant physical risk. Alternatively, if we look at the net zero 2050 scenario, there we see that temperatures are actually being curbed to about 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're expecting a fairly, hopefully, orderly transition, and we're able to mitigate a lot of the risks. Therefore, you'd see a reduction in both transition risk as well as the physical risks. Under a delayed transition scenario, effectively means that we do nothing until 2030, and in 2030 there's a rush to sort of get policies in and do certain things. That then shows that we'd actually see quite a significantly higher transition risk due to this orderly nature and disruption that's caused by those policies being pushed through. So in the final slide of mine, we basically, what the SARB did, the SARB looked at those three scenarios, climate change scenarios from the NGFS, and then said, okay, well, let's try and see what this actually means in the South African economy. What will it do to our inflation, to our interest rates, as well as our GDP? And what they found was, so on the right-hand side, or my right-hand side at least, we see that under the current policy, so if nothing else changes, we'd actually expect to see a reduction in our GDP relative to I guess, hypothetical scenario where there's no climate risk of 8% reduction by 2050, right? But if we go to net zero by 2050, what we are seeing is that you'd have initially quite due to additional costs being incurred, you'd see quite a significant impact on inflation. So you're spending a lot more to get these policies in. You'd see inflation spike a bit, and then obviously response by the monetary policy also seeing an increase in the repo rate. But because of the early action being taken, and what we end up seeing is that inflation then subsides over the longer term. Under net zero 2050, what we see under that scenario is that there is a lot of outlay initially in order to get everything sorted. There are likely to be carbon-related taxes. So as a result of that, you actually see that from a transition risk perspective, there's actually a slight increase in GDP, because the assumption is that those taxes that get taken is then reinvested into the economy and into greener technologies. So we're seeing actually a positive impact from that. Under the delayed transition, again, nothing gets done until 2030. Then there's a rush to get things done. It ends up being quite disruptive, disorderly, costing us more. So we see quite a big impact on inflation, and obviously equally impact on our monetary policy. And as you can see on the right-hand side, in the middle block, you end up having, by 2050, you end up seeing a 2% additional reduction in GDP compared to us just having done nothing. So it ends up being worse than doing nothing, is delaying.
So I'll try my best not to bring more abbreviations in, but with climate change, we've seen a really quite an accelerated increase in the body of data available to us. But in the short-term sector, there's a lag. We're not seeing as much guidance in terms of how to deal with climate change in the short-term sector. Short-term insurance, still susceptible to the same risks, and we can use the same techniques that Kershwell and the team have already discussed. So maybe to understand this in a bit more detail, I'm going to contrast the life insurance sector. At a balance sheet level, we do see, by the nature of liabilities, life insurers investing in longer dated assets, higher risk premium, and this is in order to match the liabilities. we see fewer holding in liquid cash and the higher equity. And where we do see combinations of asset funds and bonds, short-term insurers generally hold money markets funds and, on average, much shorter duration bonds, which makes sense. Short-term insurers do need the liquid assets due to the volatile nature of cash flows. Taking the balance sheet and combining this with risks, we do see this kind of unfold with more equity risk and interest rate risk for life insurers, where short-term insurers are more susceptible to counterparty default and spread risk, as well as concentration risk, largely involved around holding local banks, but quite a big difference in that respect. Moving over to, I guess, a stark contrast between the life underwriting risk and non-life underwriting risk. Kershaw had discussed a lot of the life underwriting side, but in the short-term space, we do see a more focus on catastrophe risk and premium and reserve risk. So one could argue maybe that on the asset front, the assets that we hold and the duration of these assets are unlikely to fall in durations where climate change is most to be impacted. Policies, short contract boundaries, and short-term insurers have the ability to quickly reprice any of climate change risk away as it arises. But by the end of this discussion, I hope to kind of break this misconception and show the importance of climate change. So just to highlight some of the key items. But to unravel these truths, I'm going to almost take a step back and go way back to essentially the formulation of the standard formula. When we consider the standard formula in both catastrophe risk module and the premium reserve risk module, we considered experience data up until 2009, and there was reliance on a lot of European entities and Australian entities for the work that they performed, where we then recalibrated our risks to a South African unique risk environment. Maybe to almost illustrate this more graphically, this is essentially setting up a catastrophe model which many of our reinsurers would have set up. And we'll start off with, bringing in the hazard data, which was looking around the 1950s to 2000s, with the average temperature of the world being 0.3 degrees warmer. We then move forward to bringing loss ratio data in a few decades later, maybe now 0.6 degrees warmer. These models have now been adapted and used after 2010. We're now considering 1 degree, but they've been used now to consider a world of 1.5 degree warmer and even more to 2 and 3 degree temperatures plus. And we can see this disconnect unfold in recent years. Thanks to Guy Carpenter for compiling this, across the EMEA region, we've seen an increase in the frequency and severity of climate-related events, whether it be droughts, high heat waves, flooding, and even close to South Africa, where we saw the KZN flooding in 2022. And to even further kind of illustrate the importance of this, these are the previous IPC figures where we're talking about a best case scenario of 1.5 degrees warmer by 2033. As Lance and the team have already mentioned, this view is already outdated and just shows the almost exponential change that these pathways are moving. And to say, the longer we take to bring these initiatives in, the more pronounced we see in these weather events becoming. And to further, we've simplified what these temperatures mean, plus 1.5, plus 2 degrees, but we're talking about a global average. A recent study, considering a world where the world is plus 3 degrees warmer, all countries are not the same in this scenario. You can see by the slide that the more northern hemisphere, the more southern hemisphere, including South Africa, are exposed to more increases than just the 3 degrees. So when you're considering a plus 3 degree temperature, South Africa is likely to have something even higher than this plus 3. Similar for precipitation and all the other kind of climate change impacts, not all countries are impacted the same way. But so it's clear that there has been a direct link to catastrophe risk. And recently, the ORSA Climate Change Working Group have released the Climate Index, which is tracking weather-related events across South Africa at a postal code level, monitoring temperature extremes, high precipitation, and drought conditions, and hopefully giving us the opportunity with collaboration from industry to maybe reassess how stress testing has been done historically. So we have talked a lot about catastrophe risk as one of the big risks for short-term insurers. So let's maybe move a bit to premium reserve risk. Premium risk for a short-term insurer captures a variety of risks, whether it be attritional losses, expenses. It's all captured in the one kind of risk module. But we've seen that loss ratio is likely going to be impacted by more claims from weather, but expenses, for instance, may not be as sensitive to climate change. So suggestions for the ORSA are that unbundling of this risk might be something to consider. For reserve risk, very unlikely that we see development patterns changing, but it's also important not to only consider the physical risk. Under transition risk, we could see the nature of an example for EV vehicles are fundamentally different from combustion vehicles. The salvages are likely to be less. Salvage yards can only have a certain number of vehicles that have to be distanced quite far apart. So for this particular risk, it could be fundamentally different in terms of development than our normal motor insurance. So wrapping this up in terms of, there has been quite a bit of research and still room for research in the short-term insurance industry. But for short-term insurers, it's essential to start simple. We can't underestimate the significance and severity of physical risk as well as transition risk. There are a range of further implications to consider, but one thing maybe to bring home is also to understand the importance of short-term insurers to the society and not relying completely on just being able to reprice out this risk and effectively make certain risk uninsurable, but also ensuring that we make the affordability of risk to more vulnerable populations accessible.
There is some time for questions.
I think there's one more slide and then questions. So to close out, I think it's unanimous that everybody on our working group agrees to disagree with Mr. Trump on this topic. Climate risk is indeed an important topic to consider, but it's not really a case of a matter of debate. The consideration of, in our roles as actuaries and risk professionals, this is required of us. And therefore, as part of this presentation, we've compiled a list of resources that we've gathered and which have informed this presentation and helped us develop more insight into the impact of climate change. And it's significantly and rapidly evolving risk. And remember, it's not a simple thing now, a task for us to do. Remembering it's perhaps the combination of risks that could have the more severe outcome than, and rather than just considering individual risks in isolation. As actuaries, we need to quantify the impacts arising from climate change. Our catastrophe models are quickly becoming out of date, and we need to now, relook and rethink and be critical of our methodologies and the models that we've gotten used to. And all these are key processes that are informing the ORSA. So we should, and given the rate of change that we're seeing in the physical environment and the change that lies ahead of us in terms of the transition is completely unprecedented. And so therefore, I think the message is for us to be well informed and to understand, to understand the context in this climate change environment that we find ourselves in, have an appreciation of that. And if I can just use one caption from our conference, Beyond the Numbers. So the one word of advice from one of those IFOA papers is rather use a simple model, start simple, and for that model to reflect the realities of what might unfold in terms of the impacts of climate change, than have a complex model that is in no way reflective of what impact that might result from climate change. Thank you.
There is a roving mic, so you can just indicate whether you have questions.
Maybe, yeah, while we're waiting for the mic to go, question from my side. If you look at these adverse weather conditions that continue to become more and more challenging, we saw the KZN floods, high winds. If climate change continues and we're seeing these adverse weather events happening, what does it look like for short-term insurance? And are we going to get to a point, because there was debates already happening around what is insurable risk, and some of these adverse weather patterns, even for example, potentially KZN being considered uninsurable?
Thanks for that. Yeah, so for those that hadn't seen the paper last year of the uninsurability, I think it was, just went into a lot of detail about, I guess, government, private sector's involvement to effectively protect these vulnerable areas, KZN being one in particular. It's quite a difficult task for insurers in isolation to try and protect these societies by themselves, and it does require kind of a whole industry collaboration in the sense. Until that time, I think, short-term insurers are trying to protect their book of risk as it is, and we've seen large increases coming through in KZN to effectively account for all this additional weather losses that have come through. High increases that have come, and maybe for some vulnerable sectors that are probably closer to rivers and I guess more exposed to these risks, insurance is almost becoming unaffordable in places like KZN. And it's for us as a body, almost create an environment where this is accessible to those populations is quite important. And we are protecting ourselves in terms of managing the risk by premium increases, but there might be further risk mitigation that we could consider as an alternative.
Cool, thanks, Kyle.
There's one up front here.
Hello. Oh, hi. Thanks for the presentation. So the question that I have is, I think there was a slide that Lance showed in the beginning about migrations that are happening, I think in Africa or something. What can you tell us about these migrations as in relation to who is moving and what the direction of these migrations are?
It's not necessarily what's happening right now, but also what could happen. And try and understand, like let's say in a South African context, try and understand more and more how climate change will sort of impact on our environment, as the world continues to, the temperatures continue to increase. So there's an accentuated impact, for example, on South Africa, or as Carl highlighted, areas in the far north and further north and further south of the globe, and part of that, I think, has been highlighted for governments to invest in terms of understanding that and try and mitigate and help different settlements around South Africa and other countries to adapt and increase their resilience to how different areas might be impacted. For example, Northern Cape could be very impacted. And will it be possible to, and in that environment, I think that area, for example, around Botswana is going to be, and Namibia is going to get extremely hot. And there's concern around that. And so I think, and those are the areas that we can try and foresee and try and sort of for governments to try and sort of see how what can be done to mitigate against that. So yeah, I think it's not, these are all captions of what could happen, but they're very real, and they're very real in the context of Southern Africa And that's why a lot has gone into understanding how, further global warming will impact on the natural environment here, where temperatures will increase at a higher rate. If the world increased 1.5 degrees, South Africa is going to increase more than 1.5 degrees, closer to 2.5 degrees. That's and so it's to understand that and try and anticipate and prepare for that.
Thanks.
I think we have time for one more question. In the middle there.
I have a question on stakeholders. So to what extent have we allowed for stakeholder risks? For instance, you mentioned that One Oak in the US has decided to pull out of the climate risk accords, and we are already losing our minds. So, and also you mentioned that it will take a lot of partnerships with other external bodies. To what extent have we allowed for, if they go in a different direction, and then we are the only ones left with the bad book? So what will be the next step then?
Yeah, I think that Bank Net Zero Alliance with a knock-on impact, where all the banks in the US left that alliance, and then I think the knock-on impact in Europe, sort of aware of that. And yeah, sadly, that's the outcome of Trump's current administration, but that could be actually, short-term impact. And hopefully the world, comes back to its senses. I think the world kind of does realize that it's not like things aren't changing. There's significant changes around those key global economies in converting to clean energy and tracking some, their path towards that. So it's not just a bleak picture. Progress has been made, but yeah, I did highlight the context of South Africa from that World Bank report. Quite insightful. It's about 2-3 years old, but I think we have a bigger challenge ahead of us to convert our high emissions economy to a cleaner energy economy. So I think that and the significant changes that need to come with that, embracing new skills. But I think, we're seeing changes being made all the time. We're seeing if you read the press, you see articles of clean energy projects being launched by local international companies or clean technologies, electric vehicles, etc. So this is very much happening and in process. But for South Africa as well, it also that World Bank report. It was also highlighted the importance of the policies, the right policies to be made, and criticizing South Africa's slow progress in awarding, the companies to establish their plants to produce clean energy plants and things like that. So I think we do have our challenges from a political point of view. But I think that just the more awareness and understanding of there's also paths that have been laid out for South Africa to convert to net zero. And I think, the more you sort of read up on this, the more you actually realize how much what has already been done. But it's more a case of, from making sure that South Africa takes that action, and we see that transition happening. For us and all the policy changes, carbon taxes or whatever it's going to need, that we also, get on that path to reaching net zero.
There's one over there. It has to be short. We have 2 minutes.
Yeah, very short. I just wanted to check if you considered the impact of climate risk on a parameter like employment or the rate of employment. Why I ask that is, if I look at South Africa in the mines, one response I would expect to climate risk would be automation. So automation might not come purely as a response, but because of technological advancements. And machines can work where people can't work. So, and machines don't claim benefits, for example, but that might actually result in a shift from life insurance products to more of general insurance, which is basically protection for those machines. So I don't know if anyone has considered that sort of shift in our insurance outlook. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. So there hasn't been really something to that degree. A lot of it's been overarching across, global impacts. I think the report that Lance did mention, it talked about more macroeconomic impacts on unemployment and effectively if we start going towards a net zero and investing money in transition and creating jobs through that, it talked about unemployment in that aspect. In terms of, I guess, behavioral dynamics on what happens in the future where people consider preference of different insurance products, short-term versus life, I don't think it's gone into that degree, but I guess what today's presentation is trying to cover is you can qualitatively think of this and almost consider what if. Maybe it will happen, maybe it won't happen. Is your business, I guess, a composite, obviously fine, shifting from one business unit to the other, but if you're not a composite, is this a pertinent risk where you might lose your policies to a short term and there might be a more industry focus? That's something you can play around with qualitatively, but nothing I've seen specifically in the research that would lead to that.
Sorry, I can't help myself on this topic. That World Bank report is also about South Africa's just energy transition. So that's our socio-economic kind of, environment that we have. We have widespread inequality, significant unemployment. So that's why transitioning our economy does also present a particular challenge, because we don't want, the rapid implementation of new clean energy technologies to have a significant further impact on unemployment. And I think that's the right question to ask. New technologies will come, and I think that's part of the context that we need to anticipate. And in some way, it's part of our economy, which is the economy that the short-term insurers and life insurers insure. So understanding the context is so important.
Cool. Thank you very much to the panel. It is now lunch, sponsored by Africa Reinsurance Corporation. There's also the next semi-final of the chess challenge taking place that you can go check out. Please collect your parking tickets if you haven't yet at the information desk, and wristbands for the center court cocktails tomorrow evening. And then please do go and engage on the Beyond Connect section in the app. It's the social wall. Go continue the conversation there. It only makes these kinds of conferences better. Cheers.